Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the first session of the year at the SOAS Center of World Christianity. The SOAS Center of World Christianity is dedicated to promoting the study of the historic and modern context of Christianity in Africa and Asia. The current seminar is part of a lunchtime series that invites scholars and researchers from around the world to facilitate and diversify knowledge sharing, collaborations, and networking. My name is Dr. Romina Istrati. I am UKRI Future Leaders Fellow at SOAS and co-chair of the center. And I'm joined by the chair of the center, Dr. Lars Lammen, who is senior lecturer in Chinese history at SOAS. For the first seminar of the year, we're hosting a presentation by Bruno, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Bruno Husquinet. You can pronounce it again after I introduce you to correct me, on his newly completed book, Faith, the People and the State in Russia, a Complex Interplay. Bruno is a very good friend I made also in Ethiopia in the past 2 years when I was based doing work on domestic violence in the country. I'm pleased to be able to reunite with Bruno in a different context. I'll say a little bit about Bruno's background, relevant background to the current work. Bruno holds 2 master's degrees, one in Slavic philology from the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and a second one in translation from the Institut Supérieur de Traducteurs et Interprètes, also in Brussels. He traveled extensively and lived in the post-Soviet world since 1993. As a Russian speaker, Bruno joined the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, in 2003 and worked in the Caucasus, where he spent 3 years, mainly in Chechnya. And until today, he continues to work in the humanitarian sector, primarily managing offices and conflict zones. His interest for the Slavic world remained all throughout these past years. In 2014, he was ICRC deputy head of the regional delegation at the time when the conflict in Ukraine broke out. During this time, he started exploring contemporary Russian identity, which led him to write the current book, in which he attempts to contextualize and embrace the complexity of the matter. As the book has not been published yet, this is newly completed, so it's an honor for us to be able to have an insight into this work. This session is an opportunity both for Bruno to share the book, but also to hear feedback from us and perhaps feedback that he might consider integrated in his final revisions prior to publication, perhaps. Bruno, thank you so much for being with us. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours. You have about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A with the members who have joined us today. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Romina. So without further ado, I'll probably jump directly into the matter. And perhaps to give to the audience a bit of a background on indeed the origin of the book. So as you've mentioned, Romina, I was in Russia and Ukraine in 2014. Actually, I was in Lugansk during the summer of 2014 when the conflict emerged. And what really was striking to me is that you had faith-based religious groups fighting on both sides of this conflict. There were also various individuals joining both sides, fighting on the different ideologies. And I went back to my duty station in Moscow for another year and a half. And it really, the idea of the question of Russian identity was really puzzling me. And so I started looking, is it related to economics, the change in the economic situation? Is it related to art, to literature, to culture, to religion? And then really, I couldn't really point my finger onto exactly the issue. So I decided to dig further into the matter, studied the issue, and yeah, basically this has led to the small publication here I have today. And really, 2 elements for me were fundamental. One was to look at the dissidents, because all through the history of Russia, or before Russia, no matter how state-controlled religion was, you always had dissident individuals or groups or movements that emerged. And the second main element that was interesting to me was really these messianic role that Russia had. And also this was really much echoed at that time, 2014, 2015, up to today. Really, Russians really talk about this specific special role that Russia has on the international scene beyond current politics. And so basically, this is a bit what I've tried to look at this interplay. Now, again, word of caution, I don't have affiliation. I am not a scholar or an academician, so it is pretty much my humble contribution to try to give some pieces perhaps to also contribute to the understanding of what's happening lately. So interestingly, so before, if we go back very much to the origin, before the Slavic unity, two main pieces were of interest. One, the fact that in the geographic areas where Slavic tribes were living, Christianity developed. And it is said that Andrew the Apostle traveled to now the city that is now known as Kiev, climbed onto the hill there that oversaw the Dnieper River, planted his cross, and prophesied the future of a great city. And the Goths, who were also sharing more or less the same geographic areas as the Slavic tribes at that time, embraced Christianity. And here we've got a portrait of Wulfila, who was ordained the first bishop of the Goths back in 341. Interestingly, one of their main cities was the future Kiev as well. The second element here of interest is that the Slavic tribes were practicing paganism. And we don't know much about paganism, a lot has been lost, but two main elements here are worth mentioning. One is that paganism really revolves around nature, like many other paganisms, with Mother Earth, the trees, the forest, all were very much worshipped. Obviously, the animals and the bear that is still very much associated to Russia today. And the second element in Slavic paganism that is worth mentioning here is the importance of the clan and the cult of ancestors, what is known as the rod, radin. When the Slavic unity started developing on the Rurik in the 9th century, situation unfolded quite quickly. And although the first ruler was not Christian, he was pagan as well, Olga de Kiev, a few decades later, sealed an alliance with Constantinople and converted during her trip to Constantinople. Although she converted, she didn't convert the Slavs themselves. It was only her grandson, who was raised under his grandmother's and the Christian values that she bestowed a little bit upon him, who really converted the Slavs in 988. Now, worth mentioning here that even though he converted the Slavs, paganism continued to survive and basically coexisted in some sort of syncretic dual belief that is known in Russian as dvoye. In Novgorod, we found a lot of small amulets where on one side you had a Christian symbolic and then on the other side a pagan symbolic, and this has lasted for centuries. As I mentioned, a lot of events really unfolded quite quickly. 1054, the great schism between the Eastern and Western Christians, where Rus opted for Constantinople. Yet, even though they sided with Constantinople, they really tried to gain their independence. And in 1071, they had their first saints, Boris and Gleb, the sons of Vladimir, who converted the Slavs, who were killed. And so they started already from the very beginning developing their own saints to get more independence. Whilst Kiev was still the center, it moved gradually to Vladimir Suzdal, which is near current Moscow, and this new center really competed with Kiev. The next period under the Mongols is quite interesting. So the arrival of the Mongols was seen as a curse, sent by God to punish the Slavs from their sins. At the beginning, indeed, Mongols really destroyed Kiev, damaged the cave monastery, really attacked religion, but soon their policy changed towards religion. They were much more tolerant. They gave the church the possibility to acquire lands, and then they could develop monasticism. During the Mongol yoke, the residents of the metropolitan moved from Kiev to Vladimir and then to Moscow, who was really becoming the main political and religious center in the first half of the 14th century. As paradoxically, during the Mongol yoke, Christianity and the clergy could develop and raise, became much more powerful as it was given this independence. And as it gained more power, it also faced the first dissident movement of the Strigolniki, who developed mainly in two cities, Novgorod and Pskov. I won't go into the details, but the Strigolniki were really criticizing the clergy as it had evolved for its practices. And I'm mentioning here, for instance, that they viewed the fees that the clergy was charging for religious services as an extortion. The end of the Mongol yoke happened during the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. And here, interestingly, Saint Sergius of Radonezh blessed the troops before the battle. And this kind of echo as well what we saw in recent history before they went to war. Under these historical events, the main theme of the Rus literature was the protection of the lands against two main external threats, Catholicism and the Mongols. And here I'm mentioning one of the main pieces of literature of the time, The Tale of the Destruction of the Russian Land, which really promotes unity of the land, strong leaders, autocratic, strong religious beliefs, etc. So what we saw with the end of the Mongols is really the idea that Slavs were a chosen nation that should preserve Christianity. And this was reinforced with a couple of events that happened around this period. First, Constantinople was fairly weakened at that moment. So Moscow could use this opportunity to elect its own first patriarch. Constantinople fell a few years later, which gave, obviously, on the political scene of the time, a lot of space for others, including the Slavs and Muscovy, to develop. And then the last element is that Muscovy, being now the new center, started expanding. And in this expansion of territories, they integrated the monasteries that had developed in Novgorod. So that gave a much stronger, powerful role and predominance to Moscow at that time. Unsurprisingly, in this type of environment, the concept of Moscow being the third Rome emerged. The hegumen Philophae, in his letters to a priest and the Grand Prince of the time, mentioned that previously the first Rome had fallen, the second Rome had fallen, and then the third one was Moscow, and then there shouldn't be any fourth one, which was basically giving some sort of eschatological role to Moscow and its future. For him, the fall of the first and the second Rome was not related to the barbaric invasions or to the Ottomans per se, but more by the fact that both Rome and Constantinople had stepped away from the true faith, from the Orthodoxy, and Moscow was really the guardian of Orthodoxy. And we will see further how this concept evolved over time. Under Ivan IV, a few changes happened to the church. One, massive canonization, which again gives to the Russian Orthodox Church a much more national color and flavor. Under the Strogav Council, Ivan IV really centralized further the state and the church. Additionally, the translation of the Bible was again an element that reinforced again this specific Russianity to the Orthodox Church. A few years after the death of Ivan the Terrible, the Russian Orthodox Church was given autocephaly, which was one of the main turning point, obviously, in the history of the Rock. Nonetheless, and here again, we see the dissident movement always emerging, or dissidents, people always being around. We see in the 15th and 16th century, these individuals known as the Holy Fools, who were wise individuals, but also very eccentric. And in here on the picture, you see the well-known Church of Saint Basil that was built and commanditated by Ivan IV, but is also a commemoration to Basil the Saint. Basil was one of those holy fools, plenty of stories revolving around this character. And one of them states that during a service, he saw Ivan IV. He was not really focused about what was happening. So after the service, he walked to the Tsar and reprimanded him about not being really pious in his behavior in church. And who could have, challenged the Tsar, but one of those holy fools. And again, the story goes on that when Basil died, the holy fool Basil died, Ivan the Terrible would have carried his coffin. In the history of the Russian Orthodox Church, obviously the great schism with the old believers is a major element, a turning point. So we know that there was a lot of practices, discrepancies at that time. One of the reasons is that the priests were not always very much educated, and things evolved over time. So Nikon, the patriarch, decided to reform and harmonize these practices. And in his endeavors, he was opposed by Avakum, who refused these reforms. Won't go into the details of the schism, and all believers still survive and became a powerful group and still exist today. But I just wanted to focus on the concept again of Moscow as the third Rome, which was also a source of dispute. For the old believers, Nikon and his willingness to do reforms was basically a challenge to the true faith, to orthodoxy. And that's one of the reasons why they saw themselves as, the bearers, the carriers of this true faith, and Nikon being some sort of antichrist. So in the concept of Moscow being the third Rome, they were really the one who were the old believers really saw themselves as the one who would carry this role of Moscow, being the one that would continue to preserve the Orthodox faith. Under the Peter and Catherine, what we saw was really religion being under the thumb of both the Tsar. So we know all the reforms that Peter has done for the country, but when it comes to religion, he reformed the Patriarch and formed the Holy Synod, just some sort of ministry in the newly in the state of Russia. And even though the Holy Synod was having a lot of control over the church, they were also refusing ascetics to go to the wilderness and continue their ascetic lives. They were controlling the spending of the church. They were limiting the number of monasteries that were established. And nonetheless, in this very autocratic environment, we see one of the most revered saints in Russian Orthodoxy, which is Saint Seraphim, here on the picture, who really, quoting Fyodotov, unsealed the seal which the Synod had placed on Russian sainthood by his behavior. And he was extremely respected for that, regardless of the imposition that the Holy Synod had imposed on the church. So obviously, in this environment, very much state-controlled Russian Orthodox Church, there was little tolerance for any form of deviation within the Orthodox faith. And at that time, this period as well, Dvoyeveria that we talked about, the leftover, the remnants of paganism, also suffered a lot of attacks. Paradoxically, worth mentioning here, and it's the same on the Catherine, Russia expanded its territory. That means that new population, new faiths were incorporated in the empire. So both Tsars had to display some religious tolerance to ease this absorption process, which is very pragmatic way of not creating dissension within the country. So under Catherine II, as I've mentioned, she extended and continued the policy of Peter the Great. In these territorial expansion, she confronted the Ottoman Empire and Persia. And so in this newly acquired territory, to encore the presence in the region with these wide ethnic and religious diversity, she really tried to sign agreement with the Christian communities to protect them against Muslims. It is largely believed that Catherine was not a strong believer herself, and was more, again, a very pragmatic person who displayed some tolerance for faith, but for her own internal and external plans and programs. After this period, we saw a very strong religious awakening under Alexander I, and this is mainly related to his victory over Napoleon. Emboldened by this victory, he initiated the Holy Alliance, as we know, that was signed in Paris between Prussia, Austria, and Russia in 1815. He also reformed the church by creating a Directorate of Religious Affairs and Foreign Confessions during his tenure. So what we saw under Alexander I is, one, the victory over Napoleon, the creation of this Holy Alliance, the gradual dominion over other churches that basically gives this new outreach to the Russian church. And by doing so, they obviously, Russia started representing a growing threat for the Ottoman Empire and its allies, French and British, which, as we know, led to the Crimean War, which is a completely new chapter that we will not open here. The 19th century was a brilliant and very interesting century for Russian ideas, literature, and what we saw at that time was this fragility, this debate. The Tsar, Nicholas I, was really worried that the unity of the country was being jeopardized by various groups, dissidents. So under the influence of his main advisor, the Count Uvarov, here represented on the picture, the new motto of Russia was orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. And again, nationality being this resistance to foreign influence. Again, this echoes a lot of what we can hear today. And Nicholas I initiated the redaction of a code of laws. Interestingly, three main points were mentioned there. One, that orthodoxy was the prime faith. Secondly, the Tsar cannot adhere to any other confession but orthodoxy. And then thirdly, that he was also the defender of the Orthodox faith. Under such autocratic period, it is clear that a lot of repression will be unleashed against various minorities, including the old believers. This is the period during which we see many sects also going deep into Russia, in the taiga, and they've continued living there really disconnected from the rest of the country. And associated with this movement, obviously the Russification of these new territories went hand in hand with Orthodox missionaries. And all of that, again, in the general idea that the country needs to be stabilized, and then all the political dissidents should be repressed. As I said, during the 19th century, the philosophical debate were very intense and went different directions. Here, just to mention the main oppositions between the Slavophiles and the Westerners. The Westerners, as the name mentions, were more under the influence of German philosophy, inclined towards reforms. They didn't really believe in any specific mission for Russia. Religion was not a main concern for them. When they tackled religion, it was more to denounce the abuses of the church at that time. So by opposition, the Slavophile really took their distance with the West. And one of the father of in the mid-19th century. Surprisingly, only Russia has the privilege of inspiring the worst feelings in the hearts of Europeans. And by that, he really meant that Russia had its own identity, that Europe should not interfere or try to impose its own values, and Russia would develop and continues its own path and develop accordingly to its own journey. Kirievsky, who was the second main leader of the Slavophile movement, contrasted on his side the emphasis on individualism in modern European society, mainly Catholic, with the collective social structure of the Rus. At that period, the papers, the letters of Philofey were republished, and unsurprisingly, the Slavophile really rejoiced at these letters, revived again the concept of Moscow, the Third Rome, which again mutated. And now the Moscow Third Rome was seen by the Slavophile as a project that was giving Moscow and Russia the role of uniting all the Christians under its banner, which was obviously a bit unlikely, but again, a new turn in these concepts. At the end of the 19th century, really in the pre-revolution period of Russia, what we witnessed also in literature was really a revitalized religiosity. And it seems that Orthodoxy and Marxism at the time met in their desire for political change and more social justice. It was not rare to see Marxists who would go to church. It was not rare to see priests embracing the revolution or the pre-revolution ideas. And it's only after the revolution that really this antagonism between the two came at play in Russia. So as the revolution arrived, many intellectuals were forced to leave. There's this famous moment when we had the philosophical boats where Lenin asked most of the teachers to leave the country. So hundreds of people left and continued the debate abroad, including the religious debate. And here I just want to take 2 minutes to look at one of the movement, the Eurasianism movement. So Eurasianism movement sees the world culture as a multipolar environment, and Russia having its own specificities. It is Asian from a geographical point of view. It is Slavic from a linguistic viewpoint, and it has also a large, diverse influence from Turkic region. So they in their concepts, in their views of the world, the Eurasianism view of the world, they really promote as well the idea of orthodoxy or the role of Russia as having a special mission on the global scene. On the picture you see here, you see Alexander Dugin, who's still alive. He's the leader of the Eurasianism movement. His peer in Turkey is a man called Perenchek. He was again lately in the media. There was supposedly an attack that was targeting him, but his daughter died in the incident. So moving now to the Soviet era, I will not spend a lot of time. We know how much this period tried to eradicate religion, the creation of the Society of the Godless, all the anti-religious campaigns. We know that hundreds of thousands of priests were killed, churches were destroyed. But nonetheless, all these tragic periods did not eradicate religion in Russia. And there are two main reasons for that. First, spirituality was always a very strong feature in Russian life and culture. And the second reason why they failed to eradicate religion is, although the Soviet Union tried to create this Homo Sovieticus, they never really knew how to position themselves or with regards to ethnicity or the various culture that united people in the Soviet Union. And for Russians, they're very much their culture, the music, the painting, the literature, the architecture of Russia is intrinsically linked with Orthodoxy. So fighting religion for the Russians would disembody themselves from one of the key elements that really make them Russians, that is all these elements related to Orthodoxy. After the end of the Soviet Soviet era and up to today, I divide this period into two main periods. The first one is really the 90s. We know the 90s were tragic periods, very complicated for the state, but for the churches as well. There was not enough human resources, infrastructure had not been maintained. They really needed to revisit their relationship with the state, with other Orthodox churches. They had to really define their own jurisdiction, and we see this problem in Ukraine already emerging from that time. They had to compete with other faiths as well. They were coming onto the scene, mainly Protestant, and obviously the reputational damage that we saw due to the collusion between the Russian Orthodox Church and the KGB during the previous period. Nonetheless, we have to recognize as well that the Russian Orthodox Church during these difficult 90s played an extremely important role and supported these millions of people who were really in search of spirituality in this period of transition. So again, I think this has to be acknowledged as well. And then from 2000, which corresponds to the arrival to power of Vladimir Putin, we saw really the consolidation of the Russian Orthodox Church. There were a lot of hesitation in how to accommodate the fact that Russia is a multi-ethnic, a multi-confessional country, but at the same time that Orthodoxy should be given some sort of special place in recognition of the role that it had and still plays in Russia. And interestingly, and echoing of what we saw in the 19th century and what Khomyakov was saying, the Metropolitan Hilarion in 2015 in an interview, so after the beginning of the conflict with Ukraine, has said, it is not that we are having unilateral anti-Western feelings, but the West considers Russia as lagging behind, as a country overly conservative, as a country that is not at pace with contemporary issues. Such a representation of Russia in the West dates back to the 19th century, he says. So he really echoes what we heard and wants to reposition Russia as having its own specific, its own specificities. Sorry. So in conclusion, and before we open the floor, I just want to connect with the previous sessions. So during the roundtable in Ethiopia, John Beans, and apologies for the name if I'm not correct, really said that the internal identity of some Ethiopians was conflicting. And I think he was really right. How could Ethiopians during this conflict really hold their feeling and at the same time recognizing the importance of the country, but also recognizing that they belong to a region, and at the same time identifying themselves to the Orthodox Church and Christian values, when there was this internal conflict in the country and these internecine first identity elements that makes an Ethiopian, a Russian, a Russian. Point. We know that they change over time, and in these times of conflict and tensions, these identity factors also tends to conflict within ourselves. And echoing as well one of previous speakers in the roundtable on Ukraine, Father Dragoš, I was really interested in what he said when he said that there is a cost of being a disciple of Christ, and sometimes as believers we forgot about these elements, about the fact that we need also to speak the truth to the power. And on this reflection, I was wondering, is it solely related to the situation of Orthodox believers when it comes to the situation in Ukraine, the positioning of the Orthodox churches in this conflict, or is it something, a dilemma that other confessions, and I'm thinking about Muslims, Shia and Sunni, also facing similar dilemma? It was an interesting point that Father Dragoš here also raised as to who we are as believers. So closing here, I really want to thank SOAS, the Center of World Christianity, and especially you, Romina and Lars, for welcoming me and giving me a bit of your time today.
Thank you so much, Bruno. Well done. Thank you so much. You said you're not an academic, but you've done a thoroughly detailed study and historiographical analysis that I think we've all found beneficial. I won't monopolize any further. I'll open the floor to questions. Bruno, I have multiple of my own. I'm sure we all do. I'll withhold those for the moment, and I'll pass the word. Lars, I see you nodding. Do you want to go first, maybe?
Yes, if there's no other competitor, but I found this extremely enlightening. I gave a similar paper at some point, and my emphasis was very much perhaps the socio-political role of the church rather than the the developments that you pointed out. But also interesting that you're finishing with Dugin, but because I had he came up in a very different context when I looked at this work already several years ago, maybe 10 years ago or so, when he was not so known in the West. But I just wonder whether there is an inherent, as you mentioned in one of your first slides, the coins in Kiev, that on the one side you have a Christian message and on the other side a pagan one. I wonder whether this is still imprinted in the Russian mind. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Lars. Indeed, I mean, this is a fascinating period. I think it is ingrained, and we still have a lot of leftovers, because all of these pagan traditions, beliefs, really translated into traditions, and we see that echoing in literature. We see that echoing still in the way people behave. So for example, in Russia, if you forgot your keys, you go back home. You have to look at yourself in the mirror so that the bad evil, the bad eye doesn't curse you. And all of these traditions basically have carried on from pagan time into traditions which still exist to a large extent. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else before Joe? I think you're. No, that's not a nod. Okay.
My questions would always be around animism, and just like how it's being handled now. But I think that's not really a question at the moment. It's very, very interesting. Thank you for your paper.
It's okay, Joe. I mean, you can ask anything. We do have a focus, obviously, on the conflict and how I think this kind of historiographical analysis that Bruno provides can kind of provide some insight into how to analyze the current situation. But any question related is welcome. So please feel free to ask. I actually had the honor to read your book, Bruno, which you shared. And I remember reading, actually I have it open, so I can maybe read that if you don't mind. You had something on divine exceptionalism, and I thought that was perhaps at the heart of one of the deepest insights, I guess, of this work. If you don't mind me reading that, can I read that?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Just to share an excerpt, if, I think everyone might want to hear it. You say, quote, "It would be simplistic to think that all Russians take pride in a notion of divine exceptionalism. Many Russian dissidents, lay or religious, have in common that they have rejected the official credo and chosen greater freedom, volia, instead. Throughout history, they have sought refuge in the immense taiga, cherishing free will as an expression of an untamed spiritual force, in complete independence from the exceptionalism promoted by the authorities. The starets, the peasant philosopher, or the repenting prisoner is uniquely Russian, seeking freedom and independence in times of autocratic rule. These marginalized figures are deeply patriotic and an integral part of the national soul, even if they have been killed or exiled. Russians celebrate their ethos of exceptionalism and at the same time are drawn to rebel figures who have questioned such notions. Just so Athenians sentenced Socrates to death, yet celebrate him to this day as a key figure of Greek national history." I thought that paragraph I think it kind of captures that tension, where there is this idea, and I was born in Soviet times in Moldova before it became the Republic of Moldova. It was the socialist republic under the Soviet Union, and that idea of the third Rome, Russia as the third Rome, was always inherent as a protector of all Christians or Orthodox Christians in the world. But at the same time, I think there is a spirit where everyone seeks to be free, right? And to question, a spirit of questioning at the same time. There is that narrative that is deeply inherent in all of us, I would say, even those who were in the Soviet republics, not part of of what became the Russian Federation. But I think it's something inherent that is very hard to put into words. And when I read that paragraph, I thought, well, this might be a way to kind of understand that tension within. And I find it fascinating how, exactly as you say, the authorities that might eliminate these kind of dissidents afterwards canonize them or celebrate them through national days dedicated to them, and then that tension has become part of the Russian identity, if that makes sense. And if you have any more comments on that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, and I would say, I mean, to commend that, I would just go back to my own personal experience and perhaps the genesis of this book. So at that time, I mean, there's a lot of publications were talking about, the Russian Orthodox Church as being the extension of the Kremlin, etc., etc. And then what I would see on the ground is that a lot of believers who would absolutely disagree with the church, disagree with the Kremlin, and not one or two, but like many. And I go like, but here there is something here that I'm missing. There is something that I do not understand, and I want to explore that. And that is this deeper level beyond what is being said by the figure that are first on the scene, but what is happening deeply in the society. And that is why really the book is also entitled The Faith and the People, because what I'm not really super interested is what is the credo. We know it, we hear it, people comment about it, but is it really reflecting the deep sociological waves that are happening in the society? These things are really difficult to study and analyze for a distant past, but confronted to these realities on the ground, I've tried, at least for myself, to find an explanation on and resolve this tension, as you rightly said, Romina. Thanks.
Any other questions? Thoughts, comments? This is an opportunity. Yes, Lars?
Yes, I'm trying to not to focus on the war in the Ukraine, but in a way you can't get away from it. It's this point about the believers disagreeing with the church. is probably because they realize that there is a symbiosis between the worldly function of the church that the church has to follow, and the acceptance that there is perhaps there's definitely a point where the truth of the Christian religion itself, of belief in God, does not always coincide with the structures of the church. So I wonder whether we read too much of the papal infallacy into this, because if you have a Catholic, Roman Catholic upbringing, then there is nothing wrong that that this church structure can do. If you come from a Protestant angle, these are all people. There's no belief even that there's not one jota of a belief that they could act as divine beings. So I think that the Orthodox tradition is much more Protestant than Roman Catholic in this regard. So you don't sin if you doubt the fallacy of your church leaders. That's how I would understand it. And then they are human. Therefore, they are also part of the state structure that any other individual would be part of. So these are just my thoughts, but these are not. They are neither theological nor historical. So these are just what I get out of conversations with people in the context of the war.
Well, I think, Lars, if I may say, it is partly theological in the sense that I think as Orthodox practitioner, we would know that everyone is sin prone and might fall in the trap fallacy. So that is part of being an Orthodox ascetic practitioner, walking that path, which allows, I think, that freedom to criticize, freedom to essentially decide what the truth is within yourself, right? Because that truth can be revealed to you through the Holy Spirit and through the path of divinization, as we call it in Orthodox theology. But Bruno, do you have any afterthoughts to what Lars said?
Perhaps just an additional element. So for the Russian Orthodox Church, so the way situation is presented is that they do not support the state, they support the nation. And so the role of the church is really to making sure that the nation is preserved against all sorts of attacks. And then, as we saw briefly in the history of Russia, there has been so many moments when this unity was at jeopardy. And the Orthodox Church sees itself, or part of its role is really to maintain this nation, to protect and preserve. And the states, or the state leaders, or the statesmen, indeed are lay persons. They come and go, but the nation stays. So if for the preservation of the nation, the church has to support the state against an aggression, then they will. But again, in their narrative, it is not for supporting the state. It is in fine to making sure that the nation survives. So that's the way it is coined and also relevant in the context of the Ukrainian conflict.
And Bruno, how would they call the nation in Russian? We have the term in Greek, ethnos. I now, I don't speak Russian, I speak Moldovan, Romanian. Because, Orthodox essentially stands for the unity of humanity. It shouldn't have borders. And I think this is, again, a tension, there's a theological tension that one should not allow ethnic identity or national identity supersede spiritual, the spiritual unity. And I just wonder, how did that concept of nation that is so border defined, if that makes sense, develop in Russian thought? And how would people like me, who would raise this criticism of Orthodoxy as unity of the world, be responded to within a Russian context, if that makes sense? How would those arguments fare? Sorry if this is a hard one. Or
Yeah, it is a hard one, and I genuinely do not have a full answer. I think that because the creation or the development of Russia, which basically became really Russia as we know it, the term Russia in the 15th century, quite late. And there's always been a bit of confusion. What is Russia? What is Rus? And in all of these confusion, the evolution probably has been very organic. And by nation, Russia and the Orthodox Church do not see the passport holder. They see the nation as those who speak the language. And here you can echo the fact that Russia also engaged in Ukraine to protect those who are Russian. And here there is a difference in the language between Ruski, which is the one who speak the language, who have this cultural background, and Россияnin, who are the one who hold the passport. So the nation is not the one who are confined between the borders, but those the one who associate to the Russian world, which opens up to another concept, this Ruski Mir. But that's perhaps an element to answer to your question, Romina.
Absolutely. And I have to say that when Moldova, well, Bessarabia, what used to be Bessarabia, wanted autonomy, the historical region, I mean, there was this in Transnistria, as you know, this effort by Russia, the Soviet Union, to show that there were Russian speakers there and it was Russian. And of course, when they wanted to kind of claim Moldova as their own, they wanted to Russify Moldova, so the language to be Russian. And I really relate to what your point about language as a determinant of that identity. So thank you so much for that. Any other comments and thoughts? I think we can take a few more. Yes, Richard, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, one thing that's going through my mind is we didn't mention the influence of the Vikings and the origin of the name Rus, which I remember is a Viking name. And then my mind goes on to the concept of the Kievan Rus, St. Vladimir, and the monasteries in Kiev itself, the ancient monasteries, etc. And there's a sort of a cultural sense of history there. And is part of this invasion, how can Putin use the expression, we're brothers. How much do you think this sense of the great history of the Kievan Rus and what Putin's doing today, is there any part in that in that psyche, basically? Or have I lost me?
No. I hear you, Richard. Thank you for the question. I think so. Everybody is trying to use history and then twist history to serve their own biases, right? So personally, the Kievan Rus, and I would say, is a proto-state, and it's a proto-state with a shared substrate of history for the development of the various countries that will emerge. So the Mongol yoke, the Mongol period really puts an end to this experience of unifying some of the Slavic tribes, yes, around the city of Kiev with all the symbolism associated to it during this period. But then afterwards, they can relate to these common past. I would say, a bit like all humans shared common ancestors with apes. So we have a distant relative there, but afterwards we have our own evolution. Some became Ukrainian, some became Belarusian. The Slavs of the south, the Yugoslav, have developed their own branch as well. So this is why I'd say, yes, more than brothers, they have shared ancestors. And this is how I see it. And I know that various leaders or various people today have different understanding. Vladimir was not Russian, not Putin, but Vladimir, who converted the Slavs, right? And as you rightfully say, you get the Viking, and the origin of the Slavs at that time, or what united them, is also influenced by the Greek, by the Goth, as we said, by all of these influences have generated these periods. And then afterwards, again, as I said, they lived their own life.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruno.
Yeah. That's helpful thought. Thank you.
Feel free, anyone else, to jump in. I feel, Bruno, we could speak forever because it's just such an interesting book, and I've read it, and yes, but Madame Madeleine.
Yes.
Oui, vous avez une question?
Bonjour, oui, j'ai une question. Je vais la poser en français parce que ce sera plus facile.
C'est bien.
Bruno traduira pour tout le monde. Je suis désolé, mon anglais n'est pas suffisamment parfait. Dans nos régions, on a vu à la fin du 19e siècle, début du 20e siècle, les mouvements sociaux qui se sont développés avec le socialisme et qui ont mené dans nos régions, profondément ancrées dans la religion catholique, une perte progressive de la foi, de la croyance et finalement de la participation aux églises. La Russie a connu à des époques plus ou moins semblables une révolution bien plus brutale que ce que nous avons vécu chez nous, et j'ai l'impression que la foi orthodoxe est restée très prégnante, très profonde. Qu'est-ce qui pourrait expliquer la différence entre les deux situations?
I'll pass it to you. Yeah.
He translates.
Yeah, you can translate. It's essentially juxtaposing the Catholic experience and the Orthodox. But maybe you want to translate in detail, Bruno, just to make sure.
Perhaps not in detail, but I mean the general question pertains to why the Orthodox faith seems to have resisted more to Soviet Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and to the socialist movement in more Catholic and Protestant world. I don't know if I'm the right person to comment, but I would say, at least for Russia, then narrowing down the question to the topic I'm a bit more familiar with. Again, and this is I think related to faith and the spirituality that is ingrained in the culture. And then as Lars was mentioning at the beginning, the leftover of the paganism. In our society, we burned the witches. The paganism is gone. It was burned. Nobody really burned the animist substrate of our societies like in Russia. I mean, you didn't witness this type of destruction. So I think the question is really broad, and that's all I can say. I would say yeah.
A very difficult question, très difficile, une question très difficile. Il n'y a pas de réponse, il me semble.
On va écrire un livre.
On tout va lire. We have to keep reading. Well done, though. I find it fascinating, Bruno, and I hope you find a way to publish it. I think we can all offer also feedback, perhaps, to Bruno, and if anyone has ideas of where a book like this with this topic would be most appealing and relevant. Bruno would welcome that. How I certainly see the value of it. And I think the book stops with the Ukraine crisis in 2014. Bruno, correct me if I'm wrong. Do you plan to add a chapter with the latest events now, with the ongoing conflict, or are you waiting to see how history evolves? I know it's really hard to go back to an original oeuvre and then add, but just to know your thoughts.
No, there would be certainly value in 10 years' time. No, as you said, I mean, as history unfolds, it is really difficult, because what I'm trying to do is not to comment history, is just to provide some additional clues. Again, without having the pretension that I'm explaining everything, but again, on Ukraine and the situation, what I would say is, what I think of is certainly Dumézil and the tripartite, and you can really read the situation.
I think we lost Bruno.
Yes.
I should say that Bruno is in Australia, so he might be. Bruno, you are right. Continue.
Sorry. The connection was. So the second level, again, I mean, if I refer to Dumézil, I would say that is more the political element with all the economic interplay. We know the pipeline diplomacy or realpolitik, etc. And then the big third level, the more spiritual level, is what we've talked about, these messianic mission that not only Russia but other actors that are also present in Ukraine see themselves being the carrier of. So I don't know what is going to win. I see for the moment indeed a lot of destruction, a lot of in Europe, within the Slavic world, within the Orthodox world. I am not sure how these things will end up, but certainly what we've seen over the past almost year now is pointing certainly to a worsening situation. The year to come will tell us much more. Also on the front of the various Orthodox churches in Ukraine. So there might be a follow-up, but I'm more an observer at the moment than a commenter. Yeah.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you for your humility. I think we're all observers, and it's a truly tough situation. Again, we have relatives in Russia, we have relatives in Ukraine, and I think people can kind of see past the politics of it, but at the end of the day, it affects you because, as you said, it's brother against brother, and although Ukrainians have had a different historical trajectory than the Soviets, the Russians, and so on, but still there is this idea that we are brothers, and then you have a war brother against brother, and that leaves a trauma, which I think we discussed last time at the roundtable, and I think is this trauma beyond anything else that as Orthodox believers and beyond, we would have to deal with, the legacy of that, or the consequences of that trauma beyond anything else. So I thank you first and foremost as a reader, as someone kind of involved in this community, because reading the historical, kind of having this context allows one to understand a little better. And I think what we can only do, perhaps as scholars, is to nuance the understanding to avoid further radicalization and division. We saw that in Ethiopia. We're seeing it in Ethiopia now with another imminent division in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And I don't know what we can do as people, but perhaps nuancing and showing to the world, educating might help to avoid further radicalization and division. So thank you so much, Bruno. I'm going to close the session. Clifford, well done, and we'll keep in touch. This will be posted on our YouTube channel, which gets considerably more views, so hopefully you'll reach a wider audience, and we'll share the link once this is posted today or tomorrow. Thank you all so much. Mademoiselle, Madame Madeleine, la maman, le papa du Bruno, merci beaucoup pour avoir venu. Take care, everyone. Stay well. And yeah, stay in touch for our next seminar with Archbishop Angailos in early February. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lars, allowing me to chair today.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.